Hi, and welcome to the 75th in our Middle Eastern history series. Today, we're going to be talking about modern Jordan. And since we've covered a lot of the Levant in some of our previous discussions, a lot of the things will sort of fall a little bit more naturally here. The rules, for those of you who are unfamiliar, this is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we are going to be discussing today. That said, I will endeavor to give you a secular and historical presentation, meaning that I'm not going to try and promote either side in the various different conflicts that we have. I also want to say that this, like all topics in the Middle Eastern history series, will be controversial. So let's be respectful of that controversy. That said, I love interactivity, questions, comments, clarifications. Please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. There's also at the end of 2 hours a question and answer section. So if I don't think that the comment is appropriate, I'll answer it in the question and answer section. And in that question and answer section, I will be unmuting people who want to talk. So if you have a question and you prefer to ask it in person, that's the avenue to do it. What I like to say is that these presentations are a 101 and a 201, a 101 meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up, and a 201 meaning that if you already know something on the matter, I'll probably still tell you something you didn't know. I like to say that these presentations have a 2-hour hard stop, meaning that at 9 p.m. Eastern time, whatever slide I'm on, that will be the last slide. We'll just roll everything into the next week, and we'll finish everything then, and we'll go straight to the Q&A. That way I know that I'm respecting your time, and you know that you're respecting mine. When I put dates below a person, usually these are political figures, so that is their dates of service. If I put dates below a person who is not a political figure, like a thought leader or philosopher, that may be simply their dates of life. And this, like the other 74 entries in the Middle Eastern history series and all of the other series that we do at History Mostly Ancient Discussions, will be recorded so you can watch it later. And you can see them all on our YouTube page. You can see the link there. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel to keep updated with the most recent videos from History Mostly Ancient Discussions. And if you want to be part of the Zoom, we'd love to have you. Please join our meetup at the link there, and then you will be able to see our upcoming events and get the Zoom link in order to participate live. And finally, we have premium Zoom, premium Meetup, and premium YouTube. All these things cost premiums. So if you think that this is a great service, if you've enjoyed what you've been discussing, we do appreciate you chipping in a few cents to keep the lights on. Of course, we will continue to give this these kinds of presentations for free, but donations are always greatly appreciated. All right, so I want to point out some patterns about what we're going to be seeing here in the discussion of Jordan today, right? The first thing is that, and it seems to be almost a recurrent trend here, we have these Arab Cold War alliances of the different states and where they fall on the pro-West, which is sort of blue on this map, sort of more pro Arab republics, that's sort of red on this map, and these Middle Eastern Gulf monarchies that are sort of green on this map. And you can see countries like Syria and Iraq shifted between blue and eventually becoming red, eventually becoming those republics. And Jordan, as you can see, is solidly in the Western sphere, and we're going to see that be a source of tension within Jordan. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So we're going to have tension related to that. We're also going to have tension in Jordan between two dominant categories of people: the Bedouin tribes and the Circassians on one side. These are, for want of a better term, indigenous Jordanians. And we're going to see Palestinians. These are people who, prior to 1948, were living in the territory that was the British Mandate of Palestine. And they either left or were expelled or some combination, and they've ended up in Jordan. And in fact, over 60% of the Jordanian population are these ethnic Palestinians. And so we're going to see Jordan try to invoke itself as the representative of the Palestinian people. And there's going to be tension surrounding that idea, both from the perception that Jordan should belong to the Bedouin tribes and the Circassians, who have a longer history in Jordan than do the Palestinians, and from the position that there might be representatives from the Palestinian community themselves who feel that they're better at articulating the needs and wants of the Palestinians than are a group of monarchs whose ancestry comes from Saudi Arabia. We're also going to see how the dependence on Western aid begins to shape Jordanian behavior and where it sits in the Cold War. We're going to see a lot of internal disputes, and at the same time, we're going to see Jordan trying to maintain a balance between all the different groups in the Middle East, despite having this pro-Western leaning. Can they balance the relationship that they have with Syria, with Iraq, with the West, with Egypt, with Israel, with Saudi Arabia? And we're going to see Jordan sort of pulled in all these different directions, especially when we have large-scale movements in the Middle East, like Pan-Arabism. So these movements are all going to affect Jordan, and we're going to see how that happens. So those are the things to sort of look out for. Now, if we remember, the Ottoman Empire came into World War I with this massive amount of territory. And the thing I want to point out here is that if you look at Jordan, most of the land of Jordan today is actually not part of the Ottoman Empire. It's in that desert area that exists outside of Ottoman reach. And I further want to point out that that area that sort of surrounds the desert, that's not an exact border. That's not delimited or anything. That's a slow dimmer switch of loss of control. So if you're going further east than Amman, the government in Constantinople simply doesn't control that much of the territory, and it has a vassal relationship with a number of the tribes and communities that live there. And that's pretty much the way this area was until the 20th century. So that should give you an idea of how recent Jordan is in terms of a functional creation, in terms of a sedentary creation. That is not a historical condition. And of course, we all know that the Ottoman Empire went into World War I, and then they lost pretty much everything. And part of the everything that they lost was given up in what's called the Hussein McMahon correspondence, where Lieutenant Colonel Sir Vincent Arthur Henry McMahon spoke to the Sharif of Mecca and designated to him control of all of the area in the Greens, supposedly, for a singular Arab state. Now, that's not exactly what happened. The British, led by T.E. Lawrence, ended up working with Amir Abdullah, the son of the Sharif of Mecca, throughout the war, and decided to gift him a territory of his own to rule. You can also see, for example, when we talked about the conquest of Palestine, that we focused on the red arrows, and those red arrows on the left-hand side, on the western side, that go up what's today Israel and the West Bank, those arrows are the British soldiers. But if you look on the Jordanian side, on the eastern side of the Hijaz Railway, you can see a group that's labeled Arab, and that would create corollary attacks along the railway and support the British on their northward invasion of Ottoman territory. That Arab group is Amir Abdullah. That is him leading his forces in collaboration with the British to remove Ottoman control and perhaps institute something else. And of course, we all know what ends up happening. You have the occupied zone starting in 1919, and the area that will become Jordan is entirely part of Occupation Zone East, although you can see that significant parts of Occupation Zone East also include areas that are part of Syria today, areas that are part of Saudi Arabia today. So Transjordan itself ends up being a very different shaped territory than Occupation Zone East. And it was divided this way because the French won control of Lebanon and Syria, and the British wanted control of Jordan and Iraq. That's that whole Sykes-Picot agreement that we've talked about several times. And when this happens, we already have changes that are going on within Syria. The eldest son of the Sharif of Mecca, Faisal, decides to take the throne in Damascus, and he's supported by a significant contingent of the local population. All of these people believing that he is a legitimate heir because the Hashemite family that he's a part of are descended from the Prophet Muhammad. And he is standing up to, as best he can, the colonial powers. Now, we know that Faisal, despite trying to negotiate with the French and create some sort of condominium, some sort of situation where he could continue to rule, would not be granted that permission. And the French completely destroyed him in the Battle of Maysalun in July of 1920. But you can see that the area that he claimed, it included areas that are not just part of Syria today, but also most of what is Jordan today, at least the inhabited regions of Jordan. And so when Abdullah became king of Jordan, in many ways, he considered himself the inheritor of that Hashemite Syria that Faisal had lost to the French, that those areas, in truth, belonged to him and his family. And he would get the opportunity to demonstrate that when the British took control of Transjordan. So the initial British mandate didn't actually separate Palestine and Transjordan. It was actually one entity. But it was very clear to the British that the area on the east bank of the Jordan River was an area that was very sparsely populated. It was an area that was very difficult to control because the majority of the population were either Circassians, who were a Russian mountain minority. And by Russian, we mean within the territory of Russia. They're not ethnically Russian. They're a Caucasian people that were forcibly resettled to this area after their expulsion from Russia. And in significant numbers, the Bedouin tribes. And so Lord Curzon, who was the British foreign minister tasked with organizing this area, effectively gave Transjordan in 1922. Gave Transjordan in 1920 to Emir Abdullah, basically telling him if he can figure out what to do with it, by all means, because Lord Curzon was having no success in going to the major cities of the territory and trying to get loyalty from the tribes. But that's exactly what Emir Abdullah was able to do. And so he went to Asalt, and he went to Amman, and he went to Ma'an, and he went to all the major cities throughout Jordan and spoke with the different tribal leaders and made a number of pacts with them concerning the development of a kingdom that would serve them all. And at that time, it was called an emirate or a principality. And so in April of 1921, the 11th of April, 1921, he proclaimed the Emirate of Transjordan, which would confederate all of these different nomadic tribes and the sedentary farmers that existed along the Jordan River Valley into a new emirate. From the British perspective, it was useful to have Emir Abdullah controlling this territory, one, because the British had no idea how to control it, and two, because it would mean that they could exclude Jewish settlement from that region and therefore create an area that would be at least somewhat plausibly filling the requirement that they had set for the Sharif of Mecca, that his family would inherit Arab states within the territory. And as Emir Abdullah ruled, the British felt that he was somebody that they could effectively steward in terms of the running of the territory. So in 1921, they began appointing to the emirate, so that's the year that they became an emirate. They started sending high commissioners, and these high commissioners of Transjordan would be British attachés that would live with the emir and direct his activities quite substantially. In fact, in 1928, you have the treaty, the Transjordanian Treaty of 1928, which effectively gave the British incredible amounts of control over the allocation of Jordan's military forces, over the disposition of its ministers, many different attributes in terms of how the country was run on a larger scale, However, on a smaller scale, in terms of the relationships between the tribesmen and the emir, there were elections, and deputies came to be appointed within Jordan from the various different tribes representing those local interests, and the emir would hear them out and then rule from a perspective of near absolute power. Again, we have to remember that absolute power was not circumscribed by the Bedouin tribesmen per se, but much more so by the British. And this sort of talks a little bit about the Circassian resettlement, how they came from the genocide against them, the Tsisekun in Russia, because of their Muslim religious identity. And they ended up mostly in Turkey, but also in parts of the Middle East. And it bears mentioning that when they got to Turkey and areas of the Middle East, they were not seen as helpless refugees. They were seen as soldiers, even though what they were a mixture of soldiers and helpless refugees. But because of this position, the Ottomans placed the Circassian villages where they would resettle them exactly in cross points between different ethnic or religious groups, areas where they would be able to exploit the militaristic history of the Circassians as almost like de facto peacekeepers, forced to maintain the power structure of the Ottoman Empire, because it was the Ottoman Empire that ultimately allowed them to stay in the country. And Jordan is one of the few countries in the Middle East, Israel is a possible other one, where Circassians have continued this role almost explicitly. The Circassians are overly represented in the Jordanian military, and they are represented in a number of different tribal confederations, despite the fact that they are not a tribe. They are a completely foreign ethnic group to Jordan in the sense of they were not there 200 years ago. There's a question of whether the Philby on the previous slide was a progenitor of the infamous Philby of the mid-century, who was a Soviet spy. That's his father. So yeah. All right. And so during this period of the Emirate, while this is the Mandate of Transjordan and the Emirate of Transjordan at the same time, the Jordanian military is called the Arab Legion and is an entirely British-run enterprise. John Bagot Glubb in 1939 becomes the head of this Arab Legion, and all of its commanding officers are British, but all of its major soldiers are Jordanian. And so you have this situation where the Jordanians are an effective fighting force. In fact, during the Emirate period, the military, the Arab Legion, is about 1,200 people, which is much larger than many of the other local militias. And that militia is entirely at the whims of the British, which means that the monarchy is tied very closely, not just by the literal language of the agreement and alliance with the British, but they're also tied just from a functional perspective that they can't make a military decision without the British being apprised and supportive of it. And as I mentioned, Chechens and Circassians and other Caucasus people became disproportionately represented in this, quote, Arab Legion, which really shows that the Legion wasn't necessarily representative of Jordan's population, but was representative of the population that could be seen as loyal to the monarchy. So in 1946, the Jordanians were able to declare independence, but we should understand what that independence was, because institutions, the High Commissioner, all of these other elements stayed in the country after 1946. So while now king, right? Previously he was emir, now he's king because of the independence of the Kingdom of Jordan. This emir can make a lot of executive decisions about what he wants to do, but almost all those executive decisions will have to filter through British intent and understanding of the Middle East and what needs to happen. You can also see that upon getting independence, there was the Treaty of London of 1946, in which the Jordanians basically had to pledge that they would be supporting an alliance with the British forever. And this treaty effectively made the independence hollow, because it institutionalized the process of the High Commissioner, the process of the Arab Legion being under British command, and that's how it would continue even under what was at least nominally independence. As you can imagine, the Jordanian people were not terribly excited by this reality. So let's sort of put our minds into where Abdullah was now that he was independent. The first thing, of course, is that he wanted to keep the British happy because of that requirement that of the alliance, and the fact that he didn't know if he had generals who were sufficiently effective enough to run the Arab Legion if the British were to withdraw. And so he had to look around and see what his local adversaries were. To the west, he had the nascent Zionist movement, and at this point, when Jordan becomes independent in 1946, the Zionists are pressing further and further for the British to leave the Mandate of Palestine, and in 1948, the Zionists, led by David Ben-Gurion, are going to declare the State of Israel, and Jordan will enter into a war against them. That said, King Abdullah understood that the military that the Zionists were putting together between its various different militia groups, the Haganah, the Palmach, the Irgun, the Lachi, all of these different groups were substantial enough and effective enough that they would have a good chance of beating the Arabs militarily in a conflict. And so, from his perspective, it made more sense to try and negotiate with the Zionists, see if there could be some sort of arrangement, perhaps a Jewish autonomous region in the Middle East that would be subservient to the Jordanian monarchy, or something similar that could be worked out. And in fact, Abdullah had high-level contacts with Golda Meir, with Ben-Gurion, and a number of other individuals from the Zionist camp. From the Zionist perspective, their goal was primarily the independence of a Jewish polity, one that could absorb many of the Jews who were fleeing the aftermath of the Holocaust, and one that could bring in the Jews who were increasingly experiencing problems in the Middle East and other Muslim majority countries, which was simply not on the table for King Abdullah. King Abdullah was also worried about his northern frontier with the Syrians. Shukri al-Quwatli, who was the president of Syria, was sure that King Abdullah wanted his territory. And in fact, that was entirely right. King Abdullah had visions on taking Syria because he was trying to recreate the government of Faisal that had existed in 1920, which controlled both areas of Syria and areas of Jordan. And so the Jordanians were always wary of their position vis-a-vis Syria, and were not very effective at discussing politics with them or discussing tactics with them, especially when the wars would break out. Another surprising curiosity in terms of Abdullah's situation was that Faisal, after being ejected from Damascus by the French, ended up setting up in British-controlled Iraq. And he ruled there until he died in 1936. So now the ruler of Iraq was, in actuality, King Faisal II, who was Faisal's grandson and therefore incredibly young. So the functional ruler, the regent, was Abdalillah, who was one of Faisal's other sons. And Abdalillah had designs on uniting Jordan and Iraq together. And so Abdullah I had to worry about his own family coming after his own power because of the relationship that Iraq would have with Jordan. Combine this with all of the fervor in the streets about what was going on in Mandatory Palestine between Zionist militias and, if we can use the term anachronistically, Palestinian militias, all up and down the Mandate, because fighting had broken out as early as November of 1947 between these two groups, so long before Jordan was involved directly in the war, which would start in May of 1948. And so all this brought together the fact that the Arab world was not really united at this moment. In fact, they couldn't be more confused about each other's aims, goals, and aspirations. Now, when Jordan did get involved with the war against Israel in 1948, they primarily opened up a front in what's today called the West Bank. And their front with Israel was actually the most dangerous for both the Israelis and the most effective for any of the Arab states. The primary war was trying to get Jewish control of Jerusalem. And the Zionist militias kept trying to forward a path between Tel Aviv, which was the functional capital at the time, and sending materials on a convoy towards Jerusalem, and the overlooking passes being used by the Jordanians to attack these convoys. The fiercest fighting happened in the Old City, where the Arab Legion actually performed admirably well. John Bagot Glubb led those soldiers into their engagements with the Zionist militias, and the Jordanians were successful in keeping the Old City in Jordanian hands. They were not successful in removing Israel from the western part of the new city of Jerusalem, which is the current Israeli capital. Within Jordan's area of influence, you also had Iraq's intervention. And this, of course, was very tricky for Jordan to accommodate, because as we pointed out, Regent Abdalillah of Iraq had designs on incorporating Jordan into Iraq. But at the same time, Jordan needed the support of the Iraqis if he was going to make a dent in the Zionist militias. And so the situation who ended up happening is that Iraq has free reign to send its military over Jordanian territory, but what's to stop that Iraqi military from turning right around and attacking Amman? Doesn't seem like much. And so Abdullah was always hypersensitive about the position of Iraqi troops within Jordanian territory or Jordanian-held territory because of this possibility. As we mentioned in several of the other presentations, especially the one on the history of the Palestinians, when Israel prevailed in the war in 1948 and 1949, over 720,000 to between 720,000 and 780,000 Palestinians were departed the territory that they had previously lived in. A significant percentage of those went either to the Jordanian-held West Bank or they went to the Jordanian East Bank. And so what ended up happening was that a vast number of refugee camps were established throughout the West Bank and throughout Upper Jordan in order to accommodate all of those Palestinians who are now fleeing from the Israeli government. And what ends up happening here is that the Jordanians have a very different response to the situation of the Palestinians than the other Arab powers we've looked at. the Egyptians, Lebanese, and Syrians all did not grant Palestinians any form of long-term residency, any form of work papers, any form of citizenship, any form of government assistance. Functionally, they were taken care of by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Work Agency. And that organization would provide for the welfare of the camps. But Jordan was different. Jordan made the Palestinians that came into its borders in 1948 into Jordanian citizens. So this fundamentally shifted the balance of power in Jordan, because as we discussed, the population of Jordan by this point in time was around 250, 300,000. And the number of Palestinians who entered Jordan was nearly that number. As you can see from the UNRWA camps numbers in Jordan, there are 10 official and 3 other camps today that hold about 2 million people. So that should give you an idea about how many they held a few generations ago. And in the West Bank, there's about 800,000 of them. So again, that's also areas under Jordanian control. And Jordan made it quite clear that they intended for the territories of the West Bank to be Jordanian territories. In the middle of the war against Israel, King Abdullah I held a conference in Jericho where he brought together all of the major families of Palestinians that he could find and spoke to them, incorporating their territories into Jordan and promising them the kind of representation in the Majlis an-Nawab, or the House of Deputies, that he gave to other tribes on the east bank of the Jordan. In this way, he would say that Jordan existed on both sides of the river. This was another reason why the term trans was removed from the Transjordan, because Jordan was now a country on both sides of the river. So what we end up seeing is that the Jordanian law to grant Palestinians Jordanian citizenship is almost the exact inverse of the Israeli law that granted citizenship to residents of Israel. Namely, that in the case of Israel, it was generally designed for non-Jews, and this was designed for non-Jews, that it tried to start only with people who had Palestinian nationality before the war. Same here. But this time it was a regular resident of Jordan as opposed to a consistent resident of Israel. And so that way, Jordan would attempt to incorporate Jordan incorporate the Palestinians into Jordan. Now, I have a question here of why wouldn't Arab countries, except for Jordan, want Palestinians to resettle in their countries? Lebanon is the most clear answer. In Lebanon, the Palestinian refugees would overturn the demographic issue. And we saw that when we talked about Lebanon, how precarious their demographic situation is. And in fact, the Palestinians ended up being the spark that lit up the powder keg. Syria and Egypt are a little harder to answer. I would say in the case of Syria, the amount of chronic instability that that country had and the amount of poverty that it generally had meant that people didn't necessarily want another group of people in the country to begin being functionally able to work. And Egypt already had labor issues as well. But of course, there's the cynical attitude, and I think it's warranted in this case, that the leaders of Syria and of Egypt wanted the Palestinians to remain in the camps, so that way they would continue to agitate for a return of for their own return to the mandate of Palestine and the territory it's become. And there's a question of, did Jordan see a specific advantage to adding these people to its official population? Absolutely, they did. Palestinians were on average more educated than East Bankers. They were more familiar with law, especially British law, than were East Bankers. They often had successful businesses. One of the things that we saw when we talked about Lebanon was that the Intrabank was founded by a Palestinian who fled from Jerusalem during the 1948 war. Now, of course, he's not operating in Jordan, but the same sort of rule applies. And in fact, this causes a lot of resistance from the Bedouin tribes who feel like their traditional empowered position, which is not based on meritocracy, but based on raw power and the agreements that they had made with the monarch in 1921, is being usurped by this Palestinian population who is somewhat better educated and sedentary. And sedentary and nomadic people have often had their own quarrels. But King Abdullah believed that those Palestinians could contribute meaningfully to the Jordanian economy, and was less concerned at this point. Perhaps he may have been, he should have been, because of what we're going to see later. But he wasn't as concerned that they would cause an issue. And furthermore, the lands of the West Bank that Jordan now controlled were among the more fertile territory that Jordan controlled, certainly the most densely populated territory that Jordan controlled, and over half of the population of Jordan actually lived in the West Bank because of how densely populated these areas were. One point that bears making here, though, is that not all Palestinians were in favor of being incorporated in Jordan or of King Abdullah's politics themselves. And King Abdullah I was actually assassinated in 1951 in Jerusalem by a Palestinian who was in particular angry with the fact that King Abdullah I was rumored to have, and this is a correct rumor, contacts with the Israelis, and that he was trying to negotiate some sort of long-term peace or solution with them. So in his place, Abdullah I was then subject to a succession crisis. So that succession crisis starts with King Talal and Prince Nayef. There's a question of whether the policy of Jordan enjoying the benefits of Palestinian education led to a filtering of Palestinians who were more educated, were more likely to become Jordanian. And that's just not the case. All Palestinians within the territory of Jordan after 1948 became citizens. Now, there are additional Palestinians that will come at later points, or there are Palestinians who come from other countries, right? If they were a refugee that originally went to Syria that then came to Jordan, the situation would be very different, because if we remember the law, they had to be resident in Jordan from 1948 until 1952. So if they weren't that, then they didn't get the citizenship. So we have the situation where there are two princes. Talal is the older prince, and Nayef is the younger prince. Now, Prince Nayef and King Talal were both seen as people that the British could work with. There are notes about how King Talal felt during World War II, that he wasn't terribly fond of the British, but it seems that for the most part afterwards that he was okay with them. The bigger issue was that, as I mentioned, Regent Abdalillah and his prime minister, Nouri al-Said, in Iraq, had the Fertile Crescent Plan, where it was their goal to reach out from Iraq and acquire all of the countries of the Levant region and bring them under the control of the government in Baghdad. And that Fertile Crescent Plan had a number of supporters within the Jordanian political order, and Prince Nayef bin Abdullah was one of these people. So there was a real question among the British about whether they should support Prince Nayef bin Abdullah, or whether they should support Talal. Because if Prince Nayef bin Abdullah came to power, it's very likely that he would give the British the same free reign that Abdullah I had given them. but he would be partial to ending the Jordanian monarchy. And the British felt that having two separate governments, one in Iraq, one in Jordan, was actually a better bulwark against the problems of Iraq directly manifesting towards Israel, because Iraq was virulently anti-Zionist, whereas Jordan was more moderate. And on the flip side, Jordan had already demonstrated a much better working relationship with the British than the Iraqis had. And so ultimately, they decided to go with Prince Talal to become the new king, on the idea that he would keep Jordan independent. And that's basically what he did. And as we talked about on the Syrian side, King Talal brought a new thaw in relations between the Syrians and the Jordanians, because Talal, unlike his father, had no ambitions on taking Syria. And Adibashi Shakli, the Syrian governor at that point, similarly had no ambitions to expand beyond the territory of Syria, which is rather surprising for both of them, given that they were previously individuals that had a strong idea of this pan-Levantine national state and identity. However, King Talal did not rule very long, and he didn't rule very long because he had a number of mental issues. The records on this are rather complex, and because it's personal within the royal family, we don't know as much as perhaps we would like. But it seems like King Talal basically was pursuing his wife Zaina Sharaf throughout Europe as she was trying to run away from him. He had tried to stab her. In her recollection, she came to the British embassy in Paris looking for protection from the British against King Talal. And the Jordanian government found that King Talal was medically incapable of ruling. And so his son, Hussein, Zain's, who coincidentally was also Zain's son, became the sworn-in president at the young age of 17. He would have a regent for a little bit over a year, and then he would become the ruler in his own name in 1953. One person that's worth pointing out here is that it wasn't one thing that's worth pointing out here is that it wasn't entirely clear that Prince Nayef was going to have to give up power to King Talal when they were fighting their succession crisis. In fact, several of the generals from the Arab Legion supported Prince Nayef, like Habis al-Majali. The Majalis were one of the Bedouin tribes. They're from the Karak region, which is toward the eastern part of Jordan. And Habis al-Majali was probably the most expert Arab commander in the entirety of the Arab Legion, but he had a sympathy for Prince Nayef and supported him initially before King Talal was secured his position by the British. Al-Majali fled the country, and when Hussein bin Talal became the new king, he was invited back in to the country because Hussein was looking for skilled military commanders and was willing to overlook the transgression of helping support his uncle over his father. This is actually one of the things that's quite common that people notice about Hussein ibn Talal during his rule. And we're going to talk a lot about his rule because he is in power from 1953 until 1999. But one of the interesting aspects about his rule is that he often tries to rehabilitate his enemies, often tries to work with his enemies rather than trying to ostracize them. It's not consistent, but that is generally what he tries to do. And Habis al-Majali is one among many of these kinds of examples. So one thing that's worth talking about also is Jordan's economic situation. And this is sort of an overall discussion that's going to cover the Hussein years and the Abdullah II years. Starting with Abdullah I and his relationship with the British, there was always a Western-leaning orientation among the Hashemite leaders. And in particular, this is because Jordan is a very resource-poor country. It's in a position where it has limited access to water. The Jordan River only carries so much water. Limited access to the sea. It has one coastal port city, and that coastal port city is not connected to any river or other method of transportation other than roads. It has significant desert frontiers that are hard to police or control. And they have, unfortunately for a Middle Eastern country, no access to oil. So Jordan has always been in a position where it needed financial support to maintain stability. And so forging a relationship with the United States, maintaining the relationship with the British, creating a long-term relationship with the Germans, which really was cultivated in the 1990s and has led to a number of environmental programs, as opposed to the Americans and the British, which are more of a military alliance. It's led to relationships with the Saudis and other Gulf countries, looking for support, despite the fact that those countries are much more religiously conservative than the Jordanian monarchs are. And it has led to very strange relationships that we might not expect, like Hussein's relationship with Israeli leadership and Hussein's relationship with Iraqi leadership, especially Saddam Hussein. So as we move into the 1950s, another key thing to note is that we are seeing the rise of Arab socialism. In 1952, Gamal Abdel Nasser overthrew the king of Egypt, Farouk, and began a policy of promoting the idea of anti-colonialism, Arab unity, and the idea of socialism. And the socialism that he wanted to bring about was not necessarily a collectivization of ownership of the means of production. The kind of socialism that he wanted to bring about was a redivision of assets. Middle Eastern countries during the colonial period and before the colonial period were ones in which the very wealthy had significant holdings of land, significant holdings of treasure, and the common people were relatively destitute. And so this socialism would be to divide these large estates, divide this wealth, and reapportion it among the citizenry. And this was immensely popular. And so popular, in fact, that Nasser's voice was carried throughout the Arab world, not just because of his ideas, but literally because he had a radio station, Sawt al-Arab, or the Voice of the Arabs. And this was a radio station in which he broadcast the ideas of pan-Arabism, Arab socialism, and anti-imperialism. His nationalization of the Suez Canal and other acts in the 1950s began to increasingly attract support from throughout the Middle East, and Jordan is no exception. That said, of course, we should bear in mind that Jordan is exactly the kind of monarchy, exactly the traditional kind of organizational system that Nasser was seeking to uproot. Now, the one difference, perhaps we can say, between Jordan and Egypt or Syria or Lebanon is that we don't have large-scale landowners in the Jordanian situation, because the indigenous Jordanian people, the Bedouins and the Circassians, are either nomadic, quasi-nomadic, or have very small land holdings. And the Palestinian population, which is sedentary, generally had land holdings that were small in size as well, if they had anything at all. That said, Nasser was still pointing his guns at Jordan, and we're going to see the effects of that in a few slides. The first thing that pan-Arabism resulted in with regards to Jordan is that it began to incentivize Palestinians within Jordan, and by Jordan I mean including the West Bank, to begin to develop militant organizations and to fight Israel for the return of their land. Now, those militants especially like those from, for example, the People's Liberation Front of Palestine, the PFLP, and other similar organizations, were called Fedayeen. And these Fedayeen would cross the border from the West Bank, which was Jordanian controlled, into Israel, and they would kill Israeli families, and occasionally Israel would attempt to retaliate. One particular retaliation that is well known is the Qibya massacre. This was a case where over 100 Israeli soldiers crossed the border into the West Bank and attacked the city of Qibya using heavy artillery and tanks. Dozens of people were killed, and it resulted in King Hussein becoming very irate at Israeli behavior, especially since he had been trying as best as he could to try and limit these kinds of Fida'i attacks in order to maintain a stable border. The Israelis, for their part, argued that this was a bunch of civilians who had crossed the border, even though all evidence suggests that it wasn't. And even Moshe Sharet, who was in the Israeli cabinet at the time, said that nobody would believe this because it just smacks of silliness. One of the key elements that shows that it was Israeli soldiers was that they directly attacked the Arab Legion outposts in the West Bank in order to get at Qibya, and they had advanced military equipment. The leader of the massacre is actually Lieutenant Ariel Sharon, who would eventually become the Prime Minister of Israel around the year 2000. And so Nasserism didn't just affect the Palestinians. And to be clear, the reason why Jordan was trying to limit these Fida'i excursions is that Jordan felt, based on its own military supplies and its own military ability, that if another war broke out with Israel, that the Israelis would probably win it. And so he didn't want to test that possibility. But Nasser absolutely did want to test Israel. And so that set up all of these groups on a collision course. So when Nasser had the Suez crisis and demonstrated that he was willing to nationalize the canal, increasingly populations became restive in Jordan because they saw the Jordanian monarchy was more conciliatory. They weren't taking this strong Arab nationalist tone. And if Jordan wouldn't take, Jordan under King Hussein wouldn't take that tone, they would. So King Hussein decided that he had seen what had happened in Egypt, that Gamal Abdel Nasser was a military man and had worked with several men in the military to overthrow the king. So he sought out those leaders in the military who were dissatisfied with the British control manifested by John Bagot Glubb and the degree to which the British dictated Jordanian policy, and actually asked them, would you be able to run the military if we got rid of the British? And led by Abu Nuwar, who was one of the leading generals in Jordan, and Habas Mijali, who we've talked about before, they agreed that they could, and that they would be effectively able to run the army without Lieutenant General John Bagot Glubb. So that's exactly what happened. That King Hussein gave the general notice that he had to leave Jordan immediately, and the military was able to be taken into Arab hands. So by actually creating the coup himself, he managed to avoid being overthrown by that coup. Another major decision that Hussein took during this period was that he decided to allow Jordan to have free and fair parliamentary elections, and that he would work with whatever party came to power. And it turned out the party that came to power was a Nasserist political party, represented by a new prime minister, Suleiman Nabulsi. The prime minister and Hussein clashed significantly on the future trajectory of Jordan. And those clashes led to increasing desires by the military and members of the military to launch a coup against King Hussein. Now, it's unclear exactly how these events took place in what's called the coup of 17th April 1957. But suffice it to say that in Amman, the military had divided into two factions, the larger faction being a royalist faction, and a smaller faction being an Arab nationalist faction that was post-monarchist. But King Hussein himself went to Az-Zarqa, which was in the eastern region of Jordan, and a Bedouin stronghold. Remember, most of the Arab Legion are Bedouin. And he said something to them. We don't know exactly what. Nobody's recorded it. But what he said to them captured their attention, and they ceased fighting and ended up supporting King Hussein almost uniformly after that. Some argue that this was a real coup, and through strength of will and personality, the King of Jordan overwhelmed it. Some argue that it was a false counter coup set up by the West to try and make the ensuing limiting of political parties that would happen a functional possibility, and would make Jordan more aligned with the West. Some have argued that it wasn't a coup at all, that it was some sort of misunderstanding within the military. But the loyalty that they showed Hussein is really not up for debate, because immediately the Syrians tried to support the anti-monarchist faction, the Nasserist faction within the country. Remember, Syria in 1957 is very Nasserist, and in 1958 they will unite to create the United Arab Republic. So their forces were crossing the border into Jordan, but the royalist and formerly Nasserist Jordanian military forces confronted the Syrians and were able to keep Jordan independent. Another piece that I should have mentioned earlier, chronologically earlier, is that in 1955, so before all of this experimentation with democracy, the rise of Nasserism to such an extent degree that Jordan was actually paralyzed, the British wanted to incorporate Jordan into the Baghdad Pact, which was an American-blessed organization that the British ran, with several countries trying to contain the spread of communism. Now, Jordan was not under any direct threat from communists, but being part of a Western-aligned pact would certainly put Jordan in a much better position to be a British ally. And all of these groups, the Nasserists, the military, begged Hussein not to join, and so he didn't. And it shows that Hussein would, in fact, entertain opinions that he would disagree with, because you could see that the stability of the nation really hung in the balance. Once the United Arab Republic came together, that Egypt and Syria united into one country in January of 1958, King Hussein realized that he needed some other way of pushing the monarchist union and preventing an attack from the Syrians or from the Egyptians. Now, he had already turned down joining the Baghdad Pact in 1955, and he didn't want to do anything that would directly upset the anti-monarchists, because although he had restricted their powers after the coup of 1957. Nabolsi was removed as prime minister, and he took back full autocratic control. He didn't want to create the grounds for a rebellion against his rule. So a direct alliance with the British was out. So what he decided to do is reach out to his cousin, Faisal II, who was now king of Iraq, and together they would form the Hashemite Union. And they were seeking Britain's blessing for this Hashemite Union that would protect them, perhaps against coups and other sorts of issues. But they wanted to add a third member to the union, and that would have been Abdullah III as-Salam, Abdullah III as-Salim, who was the Emir of Kuwait. But at this point, Kuwait was still under British colonial control. Kuwait would not become independent until the 1960s. And so the British refused to support the Hashemite Union if they kept courting Kuwait. Without the British support, the Hashemite Union didn't last very long, primarily because monarchical Iraq did not last very long. Within 5 months of its establishment, the Hashemite Union collapsed as Iraq was no longer a monarchist country. That was the July 14th revolution, where a number of free officers, similar to what happened in Egypt and what almost happened in Jordan, happened in Iraq. General Abdul Karim Qasim was ordered by Prime Minister Nouri al-Said of Iraq to invade Syria and destroy the United Arab Republic, or try to countermand it for Iraqi purposes. And Abdul Karim Qasim decided that instead of walking by the capital and continuing on his way to Syria, he would just go to the capital and murder the entire royal family. You can imagine from the Jordanian perspective, and you can see the picture there of Jordanian citizens learning about the execution of the Iraqi royal family, how worrying that must have been for the future of the monarchy in Jordan, considering that this was another branch of the same family. Iraq would never again become a monarchy under the Hashemites. As we move into the 1960s, we start seeing a new face to Hussein and a new issue that starts arising. Namely that Hussein, by giving citizenship to all those Palestinians in 1948, has basically claimed himself to be the spokesperson of the Palestinians. Nasser doesn't like this idea very much, because it centers power of arbitrating and negotiating the Palestinian claim with Hussein, a person he absolutely does not trust. And so Nasser begins to support a group of Palestinians who want to create what they're calling the Palestine Liberation Organization, a group of Palestinians who would run and negotiate on behalf of the Palestinian people. And so through much of 1964, you have debates, or what are functionally debates, between King Hussein talking about how it's the Jordanian military that has been protecting the Palestinians, that it's the Jordanian military that kept the largest part of Palestine under Arab rule, that Jordan is working to protect all of its citizens, and that the PLO is ultimately unnecessary because he represents Palestinian interests. And PLO leaders like Ahmed al-Shuqairi, who becomes actually the first president, first chairman of the Palestine Liberation Organization. In 1969, of course, they would elect their third and most famous chairman, their most famous chairman, Yasser Arafat, who would be in power from 1969 until his death in 2005. But the Palestinian Liberation Organization began to become more powerful than even King Hussein could tolerate. And so, could control. And so he made an agreement that the Palestine Liberation Organization could be a voice for the Palestinian people, not the only voice, but a voice, and that he would permit them to create training camps where they could begin to set up their new militant brigade called Al-Asifa, or the Storm. One of the issues that made it particularly hard for Jordan to claim that they were protecting the Palestinians was those Israeli counter raids into West Bank territory. And one of them was particularly horrendous. That's Operation Shredder. The West Bank town of Samoa was attacked on the 13th of November 1966 in a very powerful Israeli operation. The entire village was wiped out. And Hussein felt incredibly betrayed by the Israelis because despite the fact that the two countries were nominally in a state of war, Hussein had sent numerous communiques to the Israelis, continually trying to diffuse any situations that were occurring along the border in order to avoid that massive conflict that he foresaw that would cause a great calamity for the Arabs if they fought Israel again. But because the Jordanians effectively allowed this attack to happen in that they didn't fight it until it had already penetrated deep into Palestinian territory, a lot of Palestinians believed that Jordan actually was not an effective guarantor of Palestinian security, and they would need something a little bit more organized and catered to them. Not surprisingly, in 1967, that exact war came. Now, it was Israel's intent to attack Egypt and Egypt alone. And so Israel launched a preemptive strike against Egypt, taking out their air force. The Jordanians were asked by the Israelis not to join in the fight. But in order to show his commitment to the pan-Arab situation, Jordan had already signed over power of his military to Nasser as part of an agreement in 1966. And also, the Jordanians were quite angry about the Israeli military operation in Samoa and some other cases. And so on the 7th of June 1967, the Jordanians declared war on Israel. And Israel used the opportunity to take the West Bank. So instead of a divided Jerusalem and a Jordanian-controlled West Bank, the Jordanian soldiers were overrun, and the Israeli forces reunified the city under Israeli control. An additional 300,000 West Bankers came to the East Bank as a result of this war. And again, Jordan was willing to grant citizenship to those populations, considering that they they were able to continue their citizenship as Jordanians, which they had gotten previously in 1952. The loss of the West Bank was paralyzingly difficult for Hussein to deal with. Not only was this the most fertile land that his country controlled, but it was also the heart and soul of how he had been basing his legitimacy. His legitimacy is that he was effectively defending the Palestinian people, and he had really failed in that regard when it came to 1967. But his reputation would be redeemed in the following year. So 1967 didn't involve the PLO, and cross-border raids still resumed as soon as the 67 war was over. Many of these were coordinated by Yasser Arafat, who was increasingly rising through the ranks of the PLO to begin commanding operations. The Israelis crossed the border into Jordan in order to hunt him down in the town of Karame. And that battle was a difficult one for Israel. Israel lost numerous tanks, and both the Jordanian Arab Legion and the Palestinian militants led by Yasser Arafat were able in defeating the Israelis. Able to inflict heavy casualties on the Israelis relative to the size of the operation. Jordanians saw this as a victory, especially in counterpositive to the massive loss of 1967, where Egypt had lost the Gaza Strip and the Sinai Peninsula, Syria had lost the Golan Heights, and Jordan had lost East Jerusalem and the West Bank. But when Hussein saw the carnage and the victory of his soldiers, he said, "We are all Fedayeen." He would come to later regret that situation. So, starting with Karama, and we've talked about it a little bit before that point as well, Palestinian militant groups started being their own government within a government all throughout Jordan. And increasingly, those militants became more and more brazen, more and more active, to the point where these militants cruised around Amman. And it got to the point where King Hussein had to decide whether or not he was going to launch a civil war to take back his own country. And in order to do that, he needed to know where he could disposition his forces. So he actually reached out to the Israelis through a back-channel American contact, because his worst enemy in terms of capacity was Israel. But Israel was also the one most willing to negotiate with King Hussein out of all of his specific enemies, especially the Palestinians and the Syrians. And so he reached out to ask if the Israelis could effectively support Jordan by not attacking the country if it removed troops from the border, and to threaten Syria with attack if Syria was going to attack Jordan. And in fact, on the 18th of September of 1970, the Syrians actually did cross into Jordan before turning right around as the Jordanian artillery pummeled them. Now, it's the Israeli perspective that their threats to Damascus of an invasion were what kept the Syrians from following up that initial crossing with something more serious. The Jordanians contend that it was under their power that they pushed the Syrians out. But what's not up to contention is that starting in September of 1970 and continuing all the way until June of 1971, Bedouin soldiers who formed the Arab Legion went after the Palestinian militants throughout the country, culminating with a very grueling battle at Ajloun in 1971. Now, it's worth taking a second to talk about the Black September organization and its power within Jordan. As we mentioned, the PLO was operating as a state within a state in Jordan, and it began to create a military wing. Why? Because there were a number of militants within the organization who were simply too radical to be able to effectively contribute from the political side. And so this would be a way to sort of shake them off the main organization and put them in a place where they could do the terrorism they so badly wanted to do. Black September was directly attacked by the monarchy in the 1970 Black September. A particularly famous victim is Abu Ali Ayad, who was killed in that siege of Ajloun. It's believed by the Palestinians that he was intentionally targeted by Wasfi Attal. Wasfi Attal was the Jordanian prime minister, and because they thought that he had assassinated Abu Ali Ayad, he too was assassinated on 20th of November 1971. He had been Jordan's prime minister on 3 different occasions and was considered an incredibly pro-Western aligned Arab leader. It's also worth pointing out that multiple individuals within the PLO and within Black September have argued that the PLO and Black September are not separate entities. Abu Dawood was probably the most famous of these. So as we move out of Black September and Jordan begins to put itself back together, the Arab states, especially Egypt and Syria, become more wary of Jordan and its relationship with Israel, especially considering what happened in 1970 with regards to the Israeli possible intervention in the Jordanian situation. So Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Hafiz al-Assad of Syria coordinate a surprise attack called the Yom Kippur War, and numerous agitators within Jordan were angry that Jordan didn't open up a third front and join them in this attack on the Israelis. Jordan had been trying to minimize its involvement, but when they finally did get involved, it was to send soldiers to Syria in order to help push back the Israelis who had gone beyond the borders of the Golan Heights and were starting an advance on Damascus. Throughout the 70s and early 80s, Jordan actually undergoes a long period of stability. We have the creation of universities, we have the beginning of the manufacturing economy, we have larger scale agronomics, the consecration of new canals that run parallel to the River Jordan and give more area for people to grow crops. Generally speaking, this is a time of growth and development in Jordan. That's not to say that people did extremely well, but people were doing better than they had done before. This, of course, changes to a certain degree when the first Intifada breaks out in 1988. In 1987. And the first Intifada, or Palestinian uprising, was led by Palestinians in the West Bank. Of course, the West Bank is now under Israeli control and has been since 1967. And what defined the Intifada was the presence of suicide bombing and the fact that increasingly Jordan was marginalized in the conversation about Palestine and that role being usurped by the PLO. Now Jordan had agreed that the PLO could be a voice of representation of the Palestinians, but the idea that they were the definitive voice was something that was slowly beginning to be crystallized over the course of this period. Eventually, through clandestine negotiations with Norwegians, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin was able to make an agreement with PLO chairman Yasser Arafat concerning the future of a Palestinian state. And Yasser Arafat's role changed from being strictly the chairman of the PLO to also being the head of the Palestinian Authority, the effective governing body for this new quasi-state. But let's dig deeper into Jordan's thought process through this 6 years from 1987 to 1993 and what happened to Jordan's claims on the West Bank that had existed before. Jordan annexed the West Bank under its own laws in 1949. This annexation was only recognized by 4 other countries. And Jordan had been pursuing with the Israelis some sort of agreement where Jordan would again become the primary controller of the West Bank. The last time that this was brought up was in the London Agreement of 1987. Margaret Thatcher convened Shimon Peres and Hussein together, and the agreement would have been for Hussein to reoccupy the West Bank, but because of internal issues on the Israeli side, the agreement was stillborn and it never came to fruition. This caused a lasting distrust between King Hussein and Shimon Peres. And following this, in 1988, Hussein made a public declaration that he was going to give up the Jordanian claim to the West Bank and give it to the Palestinians in whatever form and representation they choose by which, of course, he meant the Palestine Liberation Organization chaired by Yasser Arafat. But while this seems like a nebulous statement to make, and one with no real no real impact, it actually had a very severe impact. So Jordan didn't actually control the territory from 1967 to 1988. That was under Israeli control. But as long as Jordan claimed that the West Bank of Palestine was Jordanian territory, its population were Jordanian citizens. By Jordan arguing that that territory was no longer part of Jordan, they effectively stripped the citizenship of everybody in the West Bank. And so what ended up happening is that people had to get what were called bridge cross cards. And the cards came in 3 colors. There is the yellow card. Yeah, there's the yellow card, which was given to those who live on the East Bank. There is the green card that is given to those who used to live in the West Bank but have family on the East Bank, so that way they can come and go through Jordan. And those with the blue card, which are usually people whose ancestry is from Gaza or somewhere else, and they are forbidden from crossing into Jordanian territory from areas under Israeli military occupation. And while this transit system had been coming into existence since 1983, it was really formalized in 1988 when all these Palestinians' citizenship was stripped. Following the agreement between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat, King Hussein was willing to make peace with Israel as well. And this peace has actually proved longer lasting than the peace with the Palestinians. King Hussein made his peace with Israel conditional on Israel continuing to work with the Palestinians and recognizing the Palestinian rights with respect to creating a second state in a 2-state solution. One of the ironies of history is that because Hussein was so turned off by Shimon Peres in 1987, when Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated and there was a follow-up election in Israel in 1995 between the left-leaning Peres and the right-leaning Benjamin Netanyahu, King Hussein actually threw his weight behind supporting Netanyahu, because better the evil you don't know than the evil you know. Ironically, and this is ironic primarily because Netanyahu has advocated a number of policies that Hussein and his successor, Abdullah II, are vehemently opposed to, such as expanding the settlements, the continued occupation, and perhaps even the annexation of Palestinian territories into Israel proper. We then get to the Persian Gulf War, which also happened in the middle of the Intifada. One of the things that we don't really talk about as much is indirect forms of aid. So the United States gave the Jordanians annually a certain amount of money as U.S. aid. So did the Saudis, so did the British. And that money helped the Jordanian monarchy stay afloat and provide a certain base level of economic functionality. But Iraq provided something else. Iraq provided oil at a massive devalued cost. A devalued cost that if Jordan were to buy that same level of petroleum on the open market, would have been worth $500 million more than he was paying every year. So in a way, Saddam Hussein paid King Hussein without paying King Hussein anything. And the two of them got on relatively well because of this oil for friendship relationship. And Hussein actually had said that he considered Saddam Hussein a personal friend of his, he having come to the country on numerous different occasions. So when the Iraqis invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, the Saudis actually called up King Hussein to ask him to go to Iraq and talk to Saddam Hussein and tell him to leave Kuwait. He did, and he tried. And in fact, he wanted to keep negotiations within an Arab context, but the distance between Iraq and the other Arab states was too great for Hussein to bridge, and so the Arabs took the issue to the UN, where the United States ended up developing a coalition that would deal with the situation. As you can see from the circles on the coalition partners, a significant number of those coalition partners were other Middle Eastern Arab states. And those states would be involved in taking Iraq down. Notably missing among them is Jordan. Jordan stayed neutral in the conflict, which is a sort of bizarre stance when you realize that the entire neighborhood, from countries as diverse as Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, Oman, Morocco, were all on the side of Kuwait. And this led to an international isolation of Jordan following the war, because of how legitimate it was seen in most Arab circles. It also ostracized him from the West, since the United States, the UK, Canada, the traditional allies of Jordan, were also involved in the war. And further, Jordanian neutrality seemed to also include allowing Iraqi Scuds to fly over the country. One of Iraq's actions during the Persian Gulf War was to send Scud missiles to Israel in the hope that Israel would retaliate, because if Israel would retaliate, a number of the Arab partners might withdraw because they wouldn't want to be on the same side of a conflict as the Israelis. And so it took a lot of persuading from the Americans for the Israelis not to return fire when all of those missiles came raining down in Israel. Following the Persian Gulf War, there aren't a lot of major events that took place relative to Jordanian diplomatic activities during Hussein's life. He died in 1999, about 8 years after the war. One particular event that I want to draw attention to is the poisoning of Khalid Mashal. Khalid Mashal is the head of Hamas, and he was based in Jordan at the time. Two Mossad agents snuck in and poisoned him, and King Hussein managed to imprison those Mossad agents. He negotiated with the Israelis that he would return their Mossad agents if they would give the antidote and allow Khalid Mashal to come back to life, which is an agreement that the Israelis actually made. His handling of the Khalid Mashal situation reasserted his dominance within the Arab world and showed that he was willing to stand up to Israel when Israel committed slights against Arabs. Before that, though, King Hussein had demonstrated to the Israelis that he actually cared about maintaining the peace that he had created between Jordan and Israel. And this was in the wake of the Island of Peace massacre. This was a massacre by a soldier who was argued by the Jordanian judiciary later to be mentally unwell, who fired into a young religious school bus on the a young religious school bus not far from the border area. This killed around a dozen people, all of them children, and King Hussein himself went to the families in Israel and expressed his condolences, and that he was hopeful that wars like this would no longer happen. That was the whole reason that he was fighting so hard to create a peace treaty between Israel and Jordan. And that is the legacy that he wants to leave, that fewer people will die, that the next generation won't know the suffering of this generation. Israelis seem to respond very positively to this acknowledgement by King Hussein. And in many respects, the event is seen as a watershed in Israeli-Jordanian relations. So in the last year or so of his life, King Hussein was struggling with cancer, and his original designee for crown prince, who was his brother, he didn't like the way that his brother was ruling when he had returned, because he had his cancer went away and then it relapsed a few months later. So during the time that he was up and active, he didn't like the way that his successor had run the country. And so he decided to choose a new successor, his son Abdullah, who had spent most of his time in the United States and had been in the Jordanian army as an Air Force officer, to be the next king. And so Abdullah II took on the role in 1999, and he is still the king of Jordan. And Abdullah was king through a variety of interesting inflection points in Middle Eastern politics, as the Middle East moved away from the Cold War and to a new threat of the Iranian-Saudi proxy wars. Of course, none of this was visible at the turn of the 20th century, but one of the things that fundamentally changed the relationship between Jordan and the United States was the attacks of September 11th, 2001, where terrorists from the organization Al-Qaeda attacked the Twin Towers in New York City, the Pentagon in Northern Virginia, and it's believed that the fourth plane, which was downed in a Pennsylvania field, was probably going to go for either the Capitol or the White House. Jordan was very quick to support the United States in its war on terror, and was a key source of diplomatic cables and information to the Bush administration in order to help it facilitate the war against these terrorist organizations. That said, in addition to that, Jordan, which had previously hosted Khalid Mashal, we talked about how the Israelis tried to poison him and King Hussein intervened in 1997. The United States and the Israelis pressed upon him to evict Hamas, and so Khalid Mashal left Jordan on a permanent basis. He might come back from time to time, but he left Jordan on a permanent basis to go to Qatar as King Abdullah closed up that organization. The Jordanians, however, were extremely strongly against Bush's desire to invade Iraq. Abdullah argued quite passionately, and I believe history has proven him correct, that the invasion of Iraq would cause massive instability, that it would not lead to a democracy, and would allow for the formation, he argued in 2004, of a Shiite crescent, where Iran would be able to influence Syria and Lebanon through a direct conduit in Iraq. And that, by and large, is what has come to pass. Never mind, of course, that Jordan, as one of the few stable countries near to Iraq, absorbed between 750,000 and 800,000 Iraqi refugees on top of its original population of around 5 to 6 million. Given that it's a country without resources, Jordan desperately needed American funds and support to begin to look after this refugee population. Despite the Jordanians being thoroughly opposed to the American war in Iraq, the Jordanians were willing to help with whatever intelligence they could within Iraq, and they provided America with key intelligence information regarding the locations of several members of Al-Qaeda. Probably most famous was Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who was killed by American forces in 2008, based on Jordanian intelligence. As we move towards 2011, of course, we have the Arab Spring in Tunisia, which was a revolt against the authoritarian stylings of Zine El Abidine bin Ali and the horrible economic situation that he had created. The anger in Jordan was not as strong as it was in Tunisia or in Egypt, which also led to the protest of Asqat al-Nizam. Sha'ab Yurid Asqat al-Nizam, as you can see in the picture, the people want to bring down the system. That was not the case in Jordan. There were protests in Jordan, and you can see them there in Amman, starting in January of 2011, and they continued throughout 2011 and into 2012. But the majority of these protesters were in favor of keeping the monarchy, and they wanted the monarchy to remain, but they were bothered by chronic problems in the economy. There was large-scale unemployment. The incredibly large numbers of Iraqi refugees were creating food and labor shortages. The government was even considering removing the subsidies that it had provided on food, which are the mainstay of the poor in the population. And so when those subsidies were cut, the protests even escalated to riots, which caused King Abdullah to reinstate the subsidies. And of course, there's a certain degree to which these protests are opportunistic, as well as simply from the grievance issues that I've raised. And that's because the Muslim Brotherhood had a historic base in Jordan. Now, we've already discussed on the Syrian side that a number of leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria during the 1980s were actually based out of Jordan. So they'd be outside of the control of the Syrians, like Saeed al-Hawa, and other members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And they believe that Jordan is too secular and should move in a more religious direction. Accordingly, what they strove to do was, through these protests, to change the government of Jordan and make Jordan a more religious government. And in fact, the Muslim Brotherhood has become part of the Chamber of Deputies, the Majlis an-Nawab, in Jordan, and has become part of the loyal opposition within their government. This, of course, is very difficult for Israel and the United States to reconcile, given that both of those countries see the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. It's also difficult for Jordan to reconcile with other Middle Eastern states, like, for example, Egypt, which has effectively declared war on the Muslim Brotherhood wherever they find them. And of course, we've talked about in Syria how destroyed that nation has become by their Arab Spring. And if we focus on the effect on Jordan, significant numbers of Syrian refugees come to Jordan. In fact, Jordan has taken more refugees in than any country other than Turkey, Lebanon, and depending on how you count them, Germany. Those refugees have actually been divided between Syrian camps like Za'atari, which is the biggest single camp with over 80,000 residents, and if they are Syrian Palestinian, meaning that they are Palestinian refugees who fled in 1949 or 1948 or 1967 or 1973 to Syria and were never in Jordan until this crisis. And so because they're not Syrians, they are subject to different rules and regulations and are connected to UNRWA rather than the general UNHCR refugee crisis. If Jordan was already struggling under the weight and buckling from the number of Iraqi refugees, the number of Syrian refugees sent that into a tailspin, and King Abdullah has continually requested from the United States, from the Western powers, more funds to help even out the ability to take care of this population and maintain a certain degree of stability in the country. And of course, Jordan sits right on the border with Islamic State. You can see that map right there, where in June of 2015, Islamic State actually controlled the Iraqi side border with Jordan. meaning that Jordan now had a land border with the terrorist entity. Jordan's particular interaction with Islamic State was through its alliance with the United States, and that alliance with the United States led to it being a coalition partner against Islamic States and fighting against it through bombing raids and other sort of support for local militias fighting on the ground. One of Jordan's Air Force pilots, Muad Kasaspa, who you can see here on the left-hand side, was downed. His plane was downed in Islamic State space, and he was locked in a cage, and he was set on fire within that cage on a video recorded by Islamic State and publicized throughout social media on the 3rd of February 2015. This action is particularly egregious for several reasons. First of all, it's the burning of a man alive on camera. But we also have to take into account the cultural sensitivity here. In Muslim society, cremation is not an option. The person needs to be buried according to very specific customs that at the end of days they can be risen. Now, by burning him, it was a direct act of blasphemy against those beliefs, and it was treating Muad Kasaspa as if he were a non-Muslim, which is in fact the argument that Islamic State were making, that the soldiers of Jordan, that the people of Jordan, despite claiming to be Muslim, were not Muslim because their version of Islam was less stringent, less intransigent than the version that they had followed. And the Jordanians themselves stood behind King Abdullah when he said that he would launch new sorties against Islamic State, and also Islamic State had asked that said that they would release Kasaspa if Jordan would perform a prisoner exchange with 2 terrorists that it held in its possession. So once Kasaspa was burnt alive, Abdullah ordered both of those terrorists to be executed immediately. Now, there was a whole meme online, and you can see that meme on the right-hand side, that because King Abdullah had served as an Air Force pilot prior to becoming King of Jordan, that he would lead the sorties himself over Islamic State. There's no evidence to suggest that he actually did that, but the strength and force of character that he demonstrated in responding to Islamic State earned him the support of many Jordanians who had seen him as a certain weaker leader than his father Hussein, and in this way he demonstrated that he was very much his father's son. I want to talk, before I get to Trump, about Rania. You can see Queen Rania actually in the picture on the left-hand side. She was the youngest queen in the world when she became queen. She was 29 at that time. And Queen Rania is an American-born Arab. So her intuitions and her cultural stylings are a little bit more Western than even other Jordanian queens who were Jordanian-born, because there are Jordanian queens who have not been Jordanian-born. Jordanian queens who are Jordanian-born would have felt. She's been a huge advocate for women's rights and other environmental and social causes, almost taking on the role of an American First Lady, just in a Jordanian context. Another point worth making is that it's very rare to see her covering her hair. She almost never does it. And in many ways shows herself as an emancipated modern woman in this Middle Eastern context. So now to Trump. King Abdullah II, like most political figures around the world, did not find Trump terribly amusing or helpful. And he tried as best he could to convince Trump not to promote the expansion of the Israeli settlements and to not move the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, rather the recognition of the capital of Israel to Jerusalem, both of which Trump did. And then Trump in January of 2020 proposed his deal of the century, which would have effectively turned the Palestinian territories into disconnected pieces and was thoroughly hated by nearly every sector of the Jordanian society, including Abdullah II, who, despite numerous opposition figures hating Abdullah, they supported him in opposing President Trump's deal of the century, and Abdullah is quite happy that the deal did not end up coming to fruition. In addition to the fact that he felt that it didn't represent the aspirations of the Palestinians in any meaningful way, he also didn't like it because it's the process for creating the deal of the century entirely sidelined Jordan. Trump had been negotiating the deal with the Saudis, who had no historical basis for representing the Palestinian people, unlike Abdullah II, who came from Jordan, a country whose majority population is Palestinian. And in fact, Rania herself, I mentioned that she was Arab American, she's actually Palestinian American. And as we move into the most recent years, we've had a number of crises that have been exacerbated by COVID. And these are the succession crises as at current. One of these succession crises is with Abdullah's first cousin, Hamza ibn, his brother, Hamza ibn Hussein. And Hamza, we're not entirely sure what the succession crisis is, but we have some details. It's believed that he was talking to a number of different tribal leaders within Jordan, and we'll sort of get to that in a second, about possibly overturning the monarchy or trying to install himself in his brother's stead. And so in April of 2021, he was put under house arrest by King Abdullah, and he remains there to this day, which is a surprising departure from what we've seen in Jordan, where a number of enemies of the state, people who oppose the regime, have become part of the government. It doesn't seem like Hamza ibn Hussein is going to be accorded the same treatment, although he is, from the word of the government, being treated with everything he needs. COVID was particularly harsh on Jordan because Jordan doesn't have its own resources and was entirely dependent on foreign vaccines, such as those from Russia or those from the United States. And those issues were compounded by the significant number of refugees in the country, the lack of jobs, the high price of food, as shipping went down, all of these major issues. And this led the various tribes to begin to come out of the woodwork. As I mentioned, the tribes have always been a constituent part of the Jordanian government. They've been the majority of the military as well. And so you see, for example, Hind al-Fayez. Hind al-Fayez is a former Jordanian MP, and she is part of the Bani Sakhr tribe, who come from the center of Jordan. And the Bani Sakhr are thoroughly opposed to the Treaty of Peace with Israel. They're also opposed to the large-scale integration of Palestinians into Jordan. A number of leaders of Bani Sakhr have argued that Palestinians should be repatriated and should be deprived of their Jordanian citizenship. In order to try and keep the peace, a number of these individuals have been arrested by Abdullah's government on trumped-up charges, and this is part of the new political discourse as increasingly protests are growing in Jordan about the cost of life issue, the cost of living issues, and the other problems that are a direct result of being in a very difficult population-wise and economy-wise situation. All right, so questions, comments, please put those in the chat. While we're doing that, I'm going to tell you a little bit about who we are. We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. I am Richard. We have been here for Middle Eastern Islamic history. Now, we will meet every Wednesday at 7. I believe that I believe that I'll be here next week, but there might be something. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at the dates. If I push everything back a week, that's what happened. We have Asian Philosophy with Jason Peng. We have Powerful Women with Jane Pendergast on June 4th, where she's going to talk about yeah, I don't remember what she's going to talk about, but and Aaron and I on the 3rd of June are going to cover the Ukraine war. So I have a question here of the anti-Palestinian stance has been consistent among the tribes all along, right? It's not been consistent among every single tribe. Generally speaking, if we want to make a general statement, the tribes are generally against the Palestinian presence. Some of them have come to accept it because they accept the legitimacy of the king, and if the king did it, the king has the power to create that situation. There are those like the Bani Sakhr who make the argument that the only reason that the king has legitimacy is because they gave him legitimacy. And so everything is ultimately at their consent. It's actually very similar in a lot of respects to the argument of states' rights in the United States, right? That the states gave power to the federal government, and therefore the states have the right of nullification if they don't agree with what the federal government is doing. Similar to how it doesn't work in the United States, at least from a federalizing standpoint, it doesn't work in Jordan. There's a book here of what books would I recommend for learning about Jordan history, particularly cultural history. That is a really great question. I personally like the book Kingmakers. I think Kingmakers doesn't just cover Jordan, it covers a lot of the Middle East, but Kingmakers does a really nice job there. There is a book by Avi Shleim on the history of King Hussein. I forget the name of the book, but that's the but that will give you a really great idea about his government. And since he ruled Jordan for just over 40 years, and through the most turbulent phases of Jordan's existence, I think that will give you a really good idea. Trying to think. If you're trying to learn about the Bedouins and the Circassians, those materials are a little harder. What I would do is I would search for the different names of major tribes like Bani Sakhr, like the Circassian Royal Guard, all these kinds of groups, and then you'll find out stories about them or obituaries, and then you can sort of see the cultural context. Thank you everybody for the kind comments. Any questions, or does anybody want to talk or talk about something? I see there's a question of looking ahead a couple generations and considering Jordan's demographics. How likely is a scenario whereby the Palestinians take over? I think that it's not unreasonable to assume that the Palestinians might take over. Palestinians at this point are about 70% of the population, but they're not reproducing any more slowly than the Bedouin and Circassian population. So the numbers are there, but I don't think it's while it's possible, I don't think it's probable. And the reason for that is that Jordan is a minority-controlled government. Because of the historic position of the Bedouin and the Circassian in the system of creating Jordan and supporting the Alawite monarchy, supporting the Hashemite monarchy, they're motivated to not lose their power. And so I think if anything, what's going to end up happening is a downgrading of Palestinian citizenship rights and permissions in order to keep this minority in control. This minority, yeah. in order for them to for the minority to keep the majority under control than the other way around. So yeah, that's that. So I think that's sort of the situation. And as long as the West continues to prop up the Jordanian monarchy, I don't think I think that they're going to be able to maintain that kind of power. So if something happens and the West can't do it, or there's some economic fiasco that just totally rocks Jordan to its core, and so people aren't in favor of the monarchy anymore, then that could change. But the position of removing the monarchy and having a democracy, which would effectively mean Palestinian rule, it's not a widespread opinion in Jordan. And it's certainly not an opinion that's held by any of the tribes that exercise power alongside King Abdullah II. There's a question of where can we view the video? The video is on our YouTube page, and so I'm putting that link in the description. You can also see that link on this question and answer page under section number 2. So if you go to that link, you can find all of our different series, and then under that, I have my my Middle Eastern history series. Of course, this is episode 75, so you'll have to scroll down a bit to find it, but it will be the most recent one there. So that's that. Anything further? All right. Thank you so much for coming, and I really appreciate. Oh, yeah. There's a comment here. Amazing how the British designed the Middle East and its effects continue to resonate. Absolutely. No, the thing about history is that it all these things have effects. All these decisions that people make, and certainly the Western imperialists had a huge hand in creating the situations that exist today, but so did all the other intervening factors. So, right, if we hadn't had that Arab Cold War between the monarchies and the republics, and trying to overthrow all these different kinds of governments, then we wouldn't have the same kind of situation we have today either. So I'm of the view that we should place fault at all of the links in the chain rather than just the ones whose skin is a little paler. All right. So thank you, everybody, and good night.